Good evening, everyone. How are you? It's good to see so many of you here. The group's getting bigger. We're going to have to get a bigger fire ring. Well, I know we're all here for the same reason, pretty much. We like to see each other and chat, tell stories. And that's kind of what I'm wanting to do right now, is tell a story. I'm going to entertain you with this one. It's more of the Untamed, TRAILIN the Night Horseman by Max Brand. It's a good story. It's easy to talk about, so. And we'll tell a little bit more of this chapter 27 right here, the conquest. There was no star-storming confidence in Kate Cumberland after that first victory. Rather, she felt as the general who deploys his skirmishers and drives in the outposts of an enemy. The advantage is his, but it has really only served to give him some intimation of the strength of the enemy. At the supper table that night, she found Whistlin Dan watching her, not openly, for she could never catch his eye, but subtly, secretly. She knew that he was measuring her, studying her, whether in hostility, amity, or mere wonder. She could not tell. Finally, a vast uneasiness overtook her, and she turned to the doctor for some relief. Dr. Randall Byron held a singular position in the attention of Kate. Since the night of the fire and her open talk with him, the doctor knew everything, and women are troubled in the presence of a man who knows the details of the past. The shield behind which they hide is in social intercourse is a touch of mystery, or at least a hope of a touch of mystery. The doctor, however, was not like other men. He was more similar to a precocious child, and she comforted herself in his obvious talent for silence. If he had been alert, strong, self-confident, she might have hated him because he knew so much about her. But when she noted the pale, thoughtful face, the vast forehead outbalancing the other features, and the wistful, uncertain eyes, she felt nothing towards him stronger than pity. It is good for a woman to have something which she may pity, a child, an aged parent, or a house dog. It provides, in a way, the background against which she acts. So Kate, when in doubt, turned to the doctor, as on this night. There was a certain cruelty in it, for when she smiled at him, the poor doctor grew crimson. And when she talked to him, his answers stumbled on his tongue. And when she was silent and merely looked at him, that was the worst of all. For he became unable to manage knife and fork and would sit crumbling bread and looking frightened. Then he was apt to draw out his glasses and make a move to place them on his nose. But he always caught and checked himself in time, which added to his embarrassment. These small maneuvers had not lasted long before the girl became aware that the silent attention of Whistlin Dan had passed from her to the doctor, and held steadily upon him. She did not go so far as to call it jealousy, but certainly it was a grave and serious consideration that measured that doctor up and down and back again, and it left her free to examine the two men in contrast. For the first time, it struck her that they were very much alike in many ways. Physically, for instance, there was the same slenderness, the same delicacy with which the details were finished, the same fragile hands, for instance. The distinction lay in a suggestion of strength and an inexhaustible reserve of energy which Dan Barry possessed. The distinction lay still more in their faces. That of Byron was worn and pallid from the long quest and struggle for truth. The body was feeble. The eyes were uncertain. But within there was a powerful machine which would work infallibly from the small to the large and the large to the small. Now with Whistlin Dan there was no suggestion at all of mental care. She could not imagine him worrying over a problem. His knowledge was not even communicable by words. It was more impalpable than the instinct of a woman. And there was about him the wisdom and the coldness of Black Bart himself. The supper ended too soon for Kate, She had been rallying Randall Byron, and as soon as he could graciously leave, the poor fellow rose with a crimson face and left the room. And behind him, sauntering apparently in the most casual manner, went Whistlin Dan. As for Kate Cumberland, she could not put all the inferences together. She dared not. But when she lay in her bed that night, it was a long time before she could sleep, for there was a voice inside her singing. She chose her time the next day. Dan alternated between Black Bart and old Joe Cumberland during most of the day, and no sooner had he left the wolf dog in the morning than she went out to Bart. As always, Black Bart lay with his head flattened against the sand, dreaming in the sun. Not an eyelid quivered when she approached, yet she understood perfectly that the animal knew every move she made. She would have attempted to dress the wound again, but memory of the ordeal of yesterday was just too terrible. She might break down in the midst of her effort, and the first sign of weakness, she knew, was the only spur which Black Bart needed. So she went instead to the chair where Dan often sat for hours near the dog, and there she took her place, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. She had no particular plan in mind, more than she had hoped to familiarize the great brute with the sight of her. And once he had known her well enough, but now he had forgotten all that passed before as completely, no doubt, as Whistlin Dan himself had forgotten. Now, while she sat there, musing, she remembered a scene that had occurred not many months before. She had been out walking one fall day and had gone from the house down past the corrals where a number of cattle, newly driven in from the range, were penned up. They were to be driven off for shipment the very next day. A bellowing caught her ear from one of the enclosures, and she saw two bulls standing horn to horn, their heads lowered, and their puffing and snorting breaths knocking up the dust while they pawed the sand back in clouds against their flanks. While she watched this, they rushed together, bellowing, and for a moment they swayed back and forth. It was an unequal battle, however, for one of the animals was a hardened veteran and scarred from many a battle on the range, while the other was a young 3-year-old with a body not half so strong as his heart. For a short time he sustained the weight of the larger bull, but eventually his knees buckled and then dropped heavily against the earth. And at that, the older bull drew back a little and charged again. This time he avoided the long horns of his rival and made the unprotected flank of the animal his target. If he had charged squarely, the horns would have been buried to the head. But striking at an angle, only one of them touched the target and delivered a long, ripping blow. With the blood streaming down his side, the wounded bull made off into a group of cows, and when the victor pursued him closely, he at length turned tail and leaped the low fence, for the corral was a new one, hastily built just for that occasion. The conqueror raised his head against the fence and bellowed his triumph. And outside the fence, the other commenced pawing up the sand again, switching his tail across his bleeding side and turning his little red eyes here and there. They fixed, at length, upon Kate Cumberland, and she remembered with a start of horror that she was wearing a bright red blouse. The next instant, the bull was charging her. She turned in a hopeless flight. Safety was hundreds of yards away in the house. The skirts tangled about her legs, and behind her the dull impacts of the bull's hoofs swept closer and closer. Then she heard a snarl in front, a deep-throated, murderous snarl, and she saw Black Bart racing towards her. He whizzed by her like a black thunderbolt, and there was a roar and bellow behind her. And at the same time she stumbled over a fence board and fell down upon her knees. But when she cast a glance of terror behind her, she saw the bull lying on its side, with a lolling tongue and glazing eyes, and the fangs of Black Bart were buried in its throat. When she reached this point in her musings, her glance naturally turned towards the wolf dog, and she started violently when she saw that Bart was slinking towards her, trailing the helpless leg. The moment he felt her eyes upon him, Bart dropped down motionless, and with a wicked baring of his teeth, his eyes closed, and he seemed, as usual, dreaming in the sun. Was the brute stalking her? It was worse in a way than the ordeal of the day before, this stealthy, noiseless approach. And in her panic, she first thought of springing from her chair and reaching a distance which the chain would keep him from following. Yet it was very strange. Black Bart, in his wildest days after Dan brought him to the ranch, had never been prone to wantonly attack human beings. Infringe upon his right, come suddenly upon him, well, and then indeed there was a danger to all saving his master. But this daylight stalking was stranger than words could tell. She forced her eyes to look straight ahead and sat with a beating heart, just waiting. Then, by slow degrees, she let her glance travel cautiously back towards Bart. Without turning her head, there was no doubt about it, the great wolf dog was slinking towards her on his belly, still trailing the wounded foreleg. There was something snake-like in that slow approach, so silent and so gradual. And yet she waited, moving neither hand nor foot. A sort of nightmare paralysis held her, as when we flee from some horror in our dreams and find that our limbs have grown numb. Behind us races this deadly thing, closer and closer. Before us is the door of safety, only a step to reach it, and yet we cannot move a foot. It was not all pure terror. There was an incredible excitement as well. Her will against the will of the dumb brute. Which would conquer? She heard a faint rustling of the sand beside her and could hardly keep from turning her head again. But she succeeded. Waves of coldness broke on her mind. Her whole body would have shuddered had not fear chilled her into motionlessness. All reason told her that it was madness to sit there with the stealthy horror sliding closer. Even now it might be too late. If she rose, the shaggy form might spring from the ground at her. Perhaps the wolf had treasured up the pain from the day before, and now a black form did, indeed, rise from the ground, but slowly, and standing on 3 legs. Bart stood a moment and stared in the face of the girl. The fear rushed out of her heart, and her face flushed hotly with relief. There was no enmity in the steady stare of the wolf dog. She could feel that, even though she did not look at him. Something that Whistlin Dan had said long before came to her. Even a hoss and a dog, Kate, can get terrible lonesome. Black Bart moved until he faced her directly. His ears were pricking in eagerness. She heard a snarl, but so low and muffled that there was hardly a threat in it. Could it be a plea for attention? She could not look down to them sharp eyes until a weight fell on her knees. It was the long, scarred head of the wolf. The joy that swelled in her was so great that it pained her like grief. She stretched out her hand, slowly, slowly towards that head, and Black Bart shrank and quivered, and his lips writhed back from the long, deadly teeth, and his snarl grew to a harsher, hoarser threat. Still he did not remove his head, and he allowed the hand to touch him between the eyes and stroked the fur back to between the ears. Only one other hand had ever touched that formidable head in such a manner. The teeth no longer showed. The keen, suspicious eyes grew dim with pleasure. The snarl sank to murmur and then died out. "Bart," commanded the girl sharply. The head jerked up, but the questing eyes did not look at her. He glanced over his shoulder to find the danger that had made her voice so hard, and she yearned to take the fierce head in her arms. There were tears that she could have wept over it. He was snarling again, preparing already for battle, and for her sake. "Bart," she repeated more gently, "lie down." He turned his head slowly back to her and looked with the unspeakable wistfulness of the dumb brute into her eyes. But there was only one voice in which Bart could speak, and that was the harsh rattle and snarl which would have made a mountain lion check itself mid-leap and slink back into its lair. In such a voice he answered Kate, and then sank down gradually, and he lay still. So simply, and yet so mysteriously, she was admitted to the partnership. But though one member of that swift, grim trio had accepted her, did it mean that the other two would take her in? A weight sank on her feet when she looked down and she saw that Black Bart had lowered his head upon them. And so he lay there with his eyes closed, dreaming in the sun. Chapter 28. The Trail. Bandages and antiseptic and constant care by themselves could not have healed Black Bart so swiftly, but nature took a strong hand. The wound closed with miraculous speed. 3 days after he had laid his head on the feet of Kate Cumberland, the wolf dog was hobbling about on 3 legs and tugging now and again at the restraining chain, and the day after the bandages were taken off and Whistlin Dan decided that Bart might run loose. It was a brief ceremony, but a vital one. Dr. Byron went out and Barry to watch the loosing of the dog from the window of Joe Cumberland's room. He and Kate observed what passed. There was little hesitancy in Black Bart. He merely paused to sniff the foot of Randall Byron, snarl, and then trotted with a limp towards the corral. Here, in a small enclosure with rails much higher than the other corrals, stood Satan, and Black Bart made straight for the stallion. He was seen from afar, and the black horse stood waiting, his head thrown high in the air, his ears pricking forward, the tail flaunting, a picture of expectancy. So under the lower rail, Bart slunk and stood under the head of Satan, growling terribly. Of this display of anger the stallion took not the slightest notice, but he lowered his beautiful head until his velvet nose touched the cold muzzle of Bart. There was something ludicrous about the greeting. It was such an odd shade close to the human. It was as brief as it was strange, for Black Bart at once whirled and trotted away towards the barns. Now, by the time Dr. Byron and Whistlin Dan caught up with him, the wolf dog was before the heaps and ashes which marked the site of the burned barn. And among these white and gray and black heaps he picked his way, sniffing hastily here and there. In the very center of the place he sat down suddenly on his haunches, pointed his nose aloft, and wailed with tremendous dreariness. "Now," murmured the doctor to Dan, "that strikes me as a singular manifestation of intelligence in an animal. He has found the very site of the very barn where he was hurt, and upon my word, even fire doesn't affect his memory." Here he observed that the face of Whistlin Dan had grown grim. He ran to Bart and crouched beside him, muttering, and Byron heard. "That's about where you was layin'," said Dan, "and you smell your own blood on that ground. Keep trying, Bart. There's something else to find around here." The wolf dog looked his master full in the face with pricked up ears, whined, and stared off, sniffling busy at the heaps of ashes. "The shooting of that dog is quite a mystery," said Byron by way of conversation. "Do you suppose that one of the men from the bunkhouse could have shot him?" But Dan seemed no longer aware of the doctor's very presence. He slipped here and there with the wolf dog among the ash heaps, pausing when Bart paused, talking to the brute continually. Sometimes he pointed out to Bart things which the doctor did not perceive. Bart whined with a terrible slavering blood eagerness. The wolf dog suddenly left the ash heaps and now darted in swiftly entangled lines here and there among the barns. Dan Barry stood thoughtfully still, but now and then he called a word of encouragement. And Black Bart stayed with his work. Now he struck out in a wide circle, running always with his nose close to the ground. Again, he doubled back sharply to the barn site and began again in a new direction. He ran swiftly, sometimes putting his injured leg to the ground with hardly a limp, and again drawing it up and running on 3 feet. In a moment, he passed out of sight behind a slight rise of ground to the left of the ash heaps. And at some little distance, he did not reappear. Instead, a long, shrill wail came wavering towards the doctor and Dan Barry. It raised the hair on the head of the doctor and sent chill through his veins. But it sent Whistlin Dan racing towards the place behind which Black Bart had disappeared. The doctor hurried after as fast as he might and came upon a wolf dog making small, swift circles, his nose to the ground, and then crossing to and fro out of the circles. And the face of the master was black while he watched. He ran again to Bart and he began talking swiftly. "Do you see?" he asked, pointing. "From behind this here hill you could get a pretty good sight of the barn, and you wouldn't be seen. Hardly from the barn. Someone must have waited here. Look here, Bart. You'll find a pile of signs around here. It means that them that done the shooting and the firing of the barn stood right here behind this hilltop and watched that barn burn, and was hoping that Satan and you wouldn't ever come out alive. And that's the story." He dropped to his knees and caught Bart as the big dog ran by. "Find 'em, Bart," he whispered. "Find 'em." And he struck sharply on the scar where that bullet had plowed its way into Bart's flesh. The answer of Bart was a yelp too sharp and too highly pitched to have come from the throat of any mere dog. Once more he darted out and ran here and there, and Dr. Byron heard the beast moaning as it ran. Then Bart ceased circling and cut down the slope away from the hill at a sharp trot. A cry of inarticulate joy burst from Dan, and then, "You've found it! You have it!" And the master ran swiftly after the dog. He followed the latter only for a short distance down the slope, and then he stood still and he whistled. He had to repeat the call before the dog turned and ran back to his master, where he whined eagerly about the man's feet. There was something uncanny and horrible about it. It was as if the dumb beast was asking for a life, and the life of a man. The doctor turned back and walked thoughtfully to the house. At the door he was met by Kate and a burst of eager questions, and he told, simply, all that he had seen. "You'll get the details from Mr. Barry," he concluded. "I know the details," answered the girl. "He's found the trail, and he knows where it points now, and he'll want to be following it before many hours have passed. Dr. Byron, I need you now, terribly. You must convince Dan that if he leaves us it will be a positive danger to Dad. Can you do that?" "At least," said the doctor, "there will be a little deception in that. I will do what I can to persuade him to stay." "Then," she said hurriedly, "sit here and I shall sit here, and we'll meet Dan together when he comes in." They had hardly taken their places when Barry entered, the wolf at his heels. At the door he paused to flash a glance at them and then crossed the room. On the farther side he stopped again. "I might be telling you," he said in his soft voice, "that now that Bart's well, I got to be traveling again. I start in the morning." The pleading eyes of Kate raised Byron to his feet. "My dear Mr. Barry," he called. The other turned again and waited. "Do you mean that you will leave us while Mr. Cumberland is in this critical condition?" A shadow crossed the face of Barry. "I'd stay if I could," he answered, "but it ain't possible." "Well, what takes you away is your affair, sir," said the doctor. "My concern is Mr. Cumberland. He's in a very precarious condition. The slightest nerve shock may have fatal results." Dan Barry sighed. "Seemed to me," he answered, "that he was bucking up considerable. Don't look so thin, Doc." "His body may be well enough," said the doctor calmly, "but his nerves are wrecked. I am afraid to prophesy the consequences if you leave him." Now, it was apparent that a great struggle was going on in Barry. He answered at length, "How long would I have to stay? One rain could wipe out all the sign and make me like a blind man in the desert, Doc. How long would I have to stay?" A few days, answered Byron, may work wonders with him. The other hesitated. Well, I'll go up and talk with him, he said, and what he wants, I'll do. This is chapter 29, Talk. Well, he was long in getting his answer. The hours dragged on slowly for Kate and the doctor, for if Joe Cumberland could hold Dan, it was everything to the girl, and if Barry left at once, there might be some root for the hope, which was growing stronger and stronger every day in the heart of Randall Byron. Before evening, a not unwelcome diversion broke the suspense somewhat. It was the arrival of no less a person than Marshal Jeff Calkins. His shoulders were humped, his short legs bowed from continual riding, and his head was slung far forward on a gaunt neck, so that when he turned his head from one to another in speaking, it was with a peculiar pendulum motion. The marshal had a reputation which was strong, over 300 miles and more of a mountain desert. This was strange, for the marshal was a very talkative man, and talkative men are not so popular on the desert. But it has been discovered that on occasion his six-gun could speak as rapidly and much more accurately than his tongue. So Marshal Calkins waxed in favor. He set the household at ease upon his arrival by announcing that they hadn't nothing for him there. All he wanted was a place to bunk in, some chow, and a feed for the horse. His trail led past the Cumberland Ranch many and many a dreary mile. The marshal was a polite man, and he had early in life discovered that the best way to get along with any man was to meet him on his own ground. His opening blast of words at Dr. Byron was a sample of his art. So you're a doc, eh? Well, sir, when I was a kid, I had a colt that stuck its foreleg in a hole and busted it short, and when that colt had to be shot, they wasn't no holding me. No, sir, I could have cleaned up on the whole family. And ever since then, I've had a hankering to be a doc. Something about the idea of cutting into a man that's always sort of tickled me. There's only one main thing that holds me back. I don't like the idea of knifing a feller when he ain't got a chance to fight back. That's me. To this, Dr. Randall Byron bowed, rather dazed, but returned no answer. And how's your patient, Doc? Pursued the irascible marshal. How's old Joe Cumberland? I remember when me and Joe used to trot about the range together. I was sort of a kid then, but I think old Joe being down in bed, sick. Why, I ain't never been sick a day in my life. Sick? I'd laugh myself plumb to death if anybody ever wanted me to go to bed. What's the matter with him, anyway? His nerves are a bit shaken about, responded the doctor, to which I might add that there is superimposed an arterial condition. Cut it short, Doc, cried the marshal good-naturedly. I ain't got a dictionary handy. Nerves, eh? Well, I don't wonder about that. The old man's had enough trouble lately to make everybody nervous. I wouldn't like to go through it myself, no sir. What with that Dan Barry? I ain't stepping on any corns, Kate, am I? She smiled vaguely, but the marshal accepted the smile as a strong dissent. They was a time not so long ago when folks said that you was kind of sweet on Dan. Glad to hear they ain't nothing in it, 's a matter of fact. But here Kate interrupted with a raised hand, and she said, I think that was the supper gong. Yep, there it is. We'll go in now, if you wish. There's only one sound in the world better than me than a dinner gong, said the profuse marshal, as they seated themselves around that big old dining table. And that was the sound of my wife's voice when she said I will. Queer thing, too, Maria ain't got a very soft voice, most generally speaking. But when she busted up in front of that preacher and says I will, why, God Almighty, asking your pardon, Kate, there was a change come in her voice that was like a bell chiming down in her throat. A bell ringing way far off, you know, so that there's only kind of a guess at it. But coming back to you and Dan, Kate, it was in vain that she plied the marshal with edibles. His tongue wagged upon roller bearings and knew no stopping. Moreover, the marshal had spent some portion of his life in a boarding house and had mastered the boarding house art of talking while he ate. Coming back to you and Dan, why we was all of us saying that you and Dan kind of had an eye for each other. I suppose we was all wrong. You see, that was back in the days before Dan busted loose. When he was on about the range, most usually, he was the quietest man I ever sat opposite a barn one, and that was a feller that went west with a bum heart at the chuck table. Oh, the marshal's daughter loomed through the big room as he recalled the delightful anecdote. He went on, but after that Jim's silent play, well, we all changed our minds some. Do you know, Doc, I was in Elkhead the night that Dan got our Lee Haines. Well, I ain't never heard of the episode, murmured the doctor. You ain't? Well, I'll be damned, asking your pardon, Kate, but you sure ain't lived in these parts long, which you wouldn't think one man could ride into a whole town, go to the jail, knock out 2 guards that was proved men, take the keys, unlock the irons off of the man he wanted, saddle a hoss, and ride through the whole town full of folks that was shooting at him. Now, would you think that was possible? Certainly not. And it ain't possible, and I'm here to state it, but there was something different about Dan Barry. Did you ever notice it, Kate? She was far past speech. No, I never guess you would have noticed it. You was living too close to him all the time to see how different he was with other fellers. Anyway, he done it. They say he got plugged while he was riding through the lines, and he bled all the way home, and he got there unconscious. Is that right, Kate? He waited an instant, and then he accepted the silence as an affirmative. Funny thing about that, too. The place where he came to was Buck Daniels' house. Well, Buck was one of Jim Silent's men, and they say Buck had tried to plug Dan before that, but Dan let him go that time, and when Buck seen Dan ride in all covered with blood, why, he remembered that favor, and he kept Dan safe from Jim Silent and safe from the law until Dan was well. Now, I seen Buck this morning over at the Rafferty place, and now here's where the marshal noted a singular look in the eyes of Kate Cumberland. A look so singular that he turned in his chair to follow it. He saw Dan Barry in the act of closing the door behind him. And Marshal Calkins turns a deep and violent red, varied instantly by a blotchy yellow, which in turn faded to something as near white as his tan permitted. Dan Barry, gasped the marshal, rising, and he reached automatically towards his hip before he remembered he had laid his belt and guns aside before he entered the dining room, as etiquette is in the mountain desert, for it is held that shooting at the table disturbs the appetite. "A good evening," said Dan quietly. "Was it Buck Daniels that you seen at Rafferty's place, Marshal Calkins?" "Him," nodded the marshal hoarsely. Yep, Buck Daniels." And then he sank back into his chair, silent for the first time in many minutes. His eyes followed Barry as though hypnotized. "Well, I'm kind of glad to know where I can find him," said Barry, and took his place at the table. The silence continued on for a while, with all eyes focused on the newcomer. It was the doctor who had to speak first. "Well, you've talked things over with Mr. Cumberland?" he asked. "We had a long talk," nodded Dan. "You was wrong about him, Doc. He thinks he can do without me." "What?" cried Kate. He thinks he can do without me," said Dan Barry. "Why, we talked it all over." The silence fell again. Kate Cumberland was staring blankly down at her plate, seeing nothing. And Dr. Byron looked straight before him and felt the pulse drumming in his throat. His chance, then, was to come. By this time the marshal had recovered his breath, and he says to Dan, "Seems like you've been away some time, Dan. Where was you been hanging out?" "I've been riding about," answered Dan vaguely. "Well," chuckled the marshal, "I'm glad there ain't no worse Jim Silence around these parts, not while you're here and while I'm here. I mean, you kept things kind of busy for Glasgow, Dan." He turned to Kate, who had pushed back her chair. "What's the matter, Kate? You ain't looking foo any tip-top. Are you sick?" "I may be back in a moment," said the girl, "but don't delay supper for me." She went out of the door with a step poised well enough, but the moment the door closed behind her, she fairly staggered to the nearest chair and sank down into it, her head fallen back, her eyes dim, and all the strength gone from her body and her will. Several minutes passed before she roused herself, and then it was to drag herself slowly up the stairs to the door of her father's room. She opened it without knocking, and then closed it, and stood with her back against it, in the shadow. Well, there you go, folks. Another part of this good story. Thanks for coming around tonight. By golly, it's good seeing every one of you. It always is. Things don't get any different when we all hang out. And I can't wait to see you all again next time here around the campfire with me, Clay Steele. So good night.